The wind moved slowly across the alien graveyard, carrying the smell of ancient dust and forgotten times, and Ethan walked carefully between the broken stone towers that reached high into the gray sky, their sharp edges casting long shadows over the cracked ground, and every step he took made a soft crunch on the layer of silver ash that covered the surface like a blanket hiding the secrets of the dead. And he had been searching here for hours, scanning the ruins for any sign of valuable artifacts or lost knowledge, but so far he had found only empty shells of alien monuments and rusted metal frames that once carried great banners of victory and now stood like bones of giants long gone. And still he kept moving, his eyes alert and his heart steady, because he knew a place like this could hide both treasure and danger. And suddenly he heard a faint sound that did not belong in the stillness around him. A weak, metallic cry like a broken bell echoing between the towering stones. And his mind froze for a moment as the sound came again. Softer this time, but filled with something that felt almost like pain, and without thinking, he began to follow it, weaving through narrow paths, between crumbling pillars and fallen slabs of strange green stone, and soon he found himself in a part of the graveyard that looked different from the rest, where the monuments were larger and carved with strange glowing lines that pulsed faintly as if breathing. And in the middle of this silent court lay a figure on a cracked stone slab, her skin pale with a faint silver sheen, her hair long and dark, spilling over the cold surface, and her eyes wide open, staring at him with fear, as if she had been waiting for him, or perhaps for anyone. And Ethan saw that her legs lay still beneath a torn cloth, and the way her body was positioned told him she could not move them, and the dust around her was marked by the tracks of alien vehicles leading away into the distance, which meant that whoever had brought her here had left her behind. And his chest tightened at the thought, because he knew that kind of abandonment was not an accident, it was a decision. And the girl's lips trembled as if she wanted to speak, but her voice was only a whisper carried away by the wind. And he stepped closer, his hands raised to show he had no weapon ready, and he said in a calm voice that he meant no harm, but her eyes still held the shadow of deep fear, as if she had already seen too much to believe anyone. And then the sound came again, but not from her this time. It came from above, a deep hum, followed by the grinding of metal, and Ethan looked up to see a massive alien drone rising from the silver dust, its metal shell covered in dark symbols, and its single red eye glowing as it scanned the ground for intruders. And the girl's breath quickened as the red beams swept toward them, and Ethan's mind raced, because he knew these machines were not built to ask questions. They were built to eliminate. And the beam touched the stone slab, making it glow faintly, and the drone's hum grew louder as it locked on. And without another thought, Ethan moved forward, scooping the girl into his arms, and she gasped in shock, because no one had carried her since the day she lost her legs and before she could speak. The red beam cut through the air where she had been a moment ago, burning a deep scar into the stone, and Ethan ran his boots, sending up clouds of ash as he ducked between the pillars, trying to stay out of the drone's line of fire. And the girl clung to him, her heart pounding against his chest, and every time the beam passed close, the air grew hot and sharp like a knife, and ahead he saw a narrow opening between two broken monuments leading into a dark passage. And without slowing, he rushed inside the beam, slicing the air behind him, and the hum of the drone following close. And the tunnel sloped downward into the earth, its walls lined with strange symbols that glowed faintly, and the air was cooler here, but thick with the scent of old stone and dust. And finally, the sound of the drone began to fade until it was gone, replaced by a deep silence, and Ethan stopped to catch his breath, setting the girl down gently against the wall, and her eyes searched his face as if trying to decide whether he was a savior or another kind of danger. And before he could speak again, something shifted in the shadows ahead, and dozens of tiny points of light appeared, moving slowly closer, like eyes opening in the dark. And Ethan froze as the lights grew brighter, and the shapes around them became clear, revealing tall figures of metal with long limbs and faces made of glowing lines, each holding a staff that pulsed with quiet power, and the girl whispered something in a language he did not understand, but the sound made the machines pause and tilt their heads toward her as if recognizing her, and Ethan's heartbeat quickened because whatever these things were, they had just decided that he and the girl were not alone down here, and the graveyard above might have been only the beginning of something much bigger and much more dangerous. The air inside the underground passage felt heavy, as if the stones themselves carried the weight of forgotten centuries, and Ethan kept his body tense, ready to move at the first sign of danger, while the strange metal figures with glowing lines on their faces stood motionless, their tall, thin frames blocking the way forward, and the girl in his arms was breathing quickly, her fingers gripping his jacket, as if letting go would mean losing the last thread of safety, and one of the metal beings stepped closer, its glowing staff humming softly and its eyes scanning Ethan from head to toe before shifting to the girl, and a faint sound came from within it, like a distant voice speaking through layers of static, calling her something that Ethan could not understand, but the way her expression changed told him the word meant something important, perhaps a name, perhaps a title, and she whispered a reply in the same alien tongue, her voice weak but steady, and the metal being stepped back slowly, lowering its staff as if granting them passage. Yet another one raised its staff again, and the hum turned into a sharp crackle, filling the tunnel with bright pulses of light, and the girl's grip tightened as she whispered to Ethan that it was not safe to stay here, and that the drone above was only a scout for something worse, and Ethan looked back toward the way they had come, the faint red glow of the drone's eye flickering at the far end of the tunnel, growing brighter with each passing second, and he realized they had only a few moments before it would find them again, and without wasting another breath, he lifted the girl once more, ignoring the ache building in his arms, and started toward the deeper part of the passage where the stone floor sloped further down, and the walls narrowed around them, forcing him to turn sideways at times to fit through, and the hum of the drone behind grew sharper, as if it had locked onto their heat, and the girl whispered that the machine would not stop until it had erased both of them from existence, and Ethan knew her words were not a warning, but a fact carved into the way these machines were built, and just ahead, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber filled with broken stone coffins and scattered relics that glowed faintly under a strange blue light leaking from cracks in the ceiling, and the moment they stepped inside, the hum of the drone echoed louder, bouncing off the walls and making it impossible to tell where it was coming from, until a beam of red light burst through one of the cracks and scorched the floor at his feet, and Ethan moved fast, slipping behind a coffin and crouching low, his breath slow and controlled, while the girl's eyes darted between the ceiling and the shadowed corners of the chamber, and then came a sound like grinding gears, followed by the slow descent of the drone through a hole in the stone roof, its red eye sweeping across the chamber with deadly patience, and Ethan's mind raced for options, because there was no way to fight it here, with no weapons strong enough and nowhere to run except back into the tunnel, where it could trap them, and his gaze caught the faint shimmer of water running along the edge of the floor, vanishing into a narrow crack, and he remembered that water could sometimes short out alien tech if it reached the right circuits, and without explaining, he shifted the girl gently onto the floor behind the coffin and moved toward the trickle of water, keeping low and silent, and the drone's eye passed over the coffin, stopping for a second, as if sensing her presence, and Ethan reached the crack, pushing his hand inside until his fingers felt cold, wet stone, and he pulled a thin metal tube from his belt, using it to channel the water upward, and the drone moved closer, its hum now a deep growl as it prepared to fire, and Ethan aimed the tube high, letting the stream hit the metal shell near the glowing lines on its side, and sparks exploded across the chamber as the drone jerked backward, its eye flickering wildly before it crashed into the floor, shaking the ground beneath them, and without waiting to see if it would rise again, Ethan rushed back to the girl, lifting her once more and heading for the far side of the chamber, where a dark opening led deeper into the earth, and behind them, the sound of metal scraping, stone filled the air as the drone began to move again, slower, but still alive, and the girl whispered that the way ahead was dangerous, but it might lead to safety if they could reach the old crypt beyond the burial halls, and Ethan only nodded, his focus locked on the narrow path ahead, where the air smelled older and colder, and the sound of the drone's grinding movements faded slightly with each step, but he knew it was only a matter of time before it caught up, and as they moved into the deeper shadows, the glow from the surface vanished, leaving only the faint blue shimmer from strange symbols carved into the walls, and the girl rested her head against his shoulder, whispering words he could not understand, but he felt the meaning in the way her voice trembled, like she was placing a fragile trust in him, and he knew that whatever lay ahead in this darkness, it was better than the fate waiting for her in the graveyard above. And yet, the silence here did not feel safe. It felt like the kind of silence that comes just before the ground itself decides to shift, and in the far distance something began to glow brighter and move slowly toward them. Its light, soft, and steady, but the feeling it carried was not of welcome. It was the slow and certain approach of something that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time. The glow ahead grew stronger with each step until the shapes began to take form in the dim light, and Ethan slowed his pace, keeping the girl close to his chest while his eyes searched the uneven floor for traps or loose stones, and the air had a strange metallic taste, as if they were breathing in the remains of something that had been here for centuries. And soon the tunnel opened into a wide circular hall with a high ceiling covered in carvings of strange figures holding staffs and orbs, and around the edges of the hall stood tall machines like statues, their surfaces smooth and silver with faint blue lines running across them, and at the center of the floor was a stone platform surrounded by glowing symbols that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. And Ethan stepped carefully into the hall, his boots brushing against fine dust that swirled in the cold air, and the girl stirred in his arms, her eyes opening wider when she saw the carvings above them, and she whispered something in her language, a single word that seemed to echo around the chamber as if the walls themselves knew it, and the statues came to life, their heads turning in perfect unison, their blue lines brightening as they stepped forward, forming a circle around the platform, and one of them spoke in a voice that was neither male nor female, but deep and resonant, calling the girl Princess of the Forgotten. And Ethan looked down at her, confused, but she shook her head and whispered not to believe them, because the truth was not so simple. And the machines raised their staffs, pointing them toward the platform, and the glow from the symbols grew stronger, bathing the room in light, and Ethan felt the floor vibrate beneath his feet as if something below them was awakening. And the voice of the machine spoke again, saying the princess had returned to claim the vault of the old kings. And Ethan tightened his hold on her, because the word vault suggested something valuable and dangerous. And she whispered that her family had left her in the graveyard, so she would never reach this place, because inside the vault was a key to ending their rule, and she had refused to give it to them. And Ethan felt the weight of her words, but before he could speak, the ground shook violently, and a deep rumble echoed from the far side of the hall, where a massive stone door began to rise, revealing a tunnel that descended into darkness, and the air that flowed from it was cold and heavy with the smell of metal and oil. And the machines stepped aside as if granting them passage, but the girl shook her head again, telling Ethan that once they entered the vault, they would be hunted by more than just the drone outside, and he knew she meant hunters with flesh and blood, the kind that would not stop until their target was gone. And from far above came the distant thrum of engines, a sound that made his stomach tighten because it was heavier and deeper than the drone, the sound of alien ships landing. And the machines turned their heads toward the ceiling as if listening, and the blue lines on their bodies flickered rapidly before they faced Ethan again, their voice saying, "The hunters have come, and the vault must be protected." And Ethan realized that the ships above were bringing the ones who had abandoned her, and they would not leave without her. And he looked at the dark tunnel beyond the stone door, knowing it was their only path now, but also knowing it might hold dangers they could not imagine, and the girl's hand gripped his jacket tightly. Her eyes locked on his face, as if silently asking if he was truly willing to go this far, and he nodded without hesitation, stepping onto the platform and crossing into the mouth of the tunnel, and the machines moved behind them, lowering their staffs in a gesture that could have been a salute or a warning in the moment. They stepped past the threshold, the stone door began to sink back into place, sealing the hall from view, and the darkness swallowed them, except for the faint light from the symbols on the walls, which now glowed in a steady rhythm, guiding their steps downward, and the air grew colder, and the floor became smoother, as if carved by perfect tools, and far ahead, the light from the symbols reflected off something metallic and curved, and Ethan could hear the faint hum of machinery. Still alive after all these years, and the girl whispered that this was the entrance to the vault, and that beyond this door lay the thing her family feared most, and Ethan asked what it was, and she hesitated before answering that it was not a weapon and not a treasure, but a choice, and before he could ask what she meant, the ground shook again, harder this time, and from behind them came the muffled roar of alien voices echoing down the tunnel, followed by the sharp hiss of weapons charging, and Ethan knew the hunters had already entered the hall above and were coming fast, and the metallic door before them slid open without a sound, revealing a room filled with a soft golden light and a strange machine in the center, shaped like a spiral of metal and crystal reaching up to the ceiling, and at its base was a single seat designed for someone of her kind, and the girl's breath caught in her throat as she stared at it, and she told him this was the throne of the first memory, and whoever sat on it could speak to every mind in her empire and change the way they thought forever. And Ethan finally understood why her family had feared her and why they had left her to die, but there was no time to think, because the sound of boots on stone was growing louder, and the first flash of red light from the hunter's weapons appeared at the far end of the tunnel, and Ethan stepped forward into the room, ready to defend her, no matter what came through that door next. The golden light from the strange throne cast long shadows across the walls, and Ethan stood just in front of it, his body angled to shield the girl, while the hum of the alien spiral filled the air with a deep, slow vibration, and the tunnel behind them echoed with the sharp rhythm of approaching boots, mixed with the metallic hiss of weapons being prepared to fire, and the girl's breathing quickened, her eyes locked on the entrance as she whispered that those coming were not strangers. They were her own family's guards, trained to follow orders without hesitation, and their mission was simple: to make sure she never left this place alive. And Ethan tightened his grip on the small blade he carried, knowing it was useless against energy rifles, but unwilling to stand unarmed, and the first figure appeared in the tunnel, clad in dark armor with a glowing visor, and its weapon raised, and the sight of the girl in Ethan's arms made it pause only for a second before it fired a bright bolt that scorched the wall inches from Ethan's head, and he moved fast, pulling the girl toward the side of the chamber where a heavy pillar offered some cover, and the sound of more boots filled the tunnel as the rest of the hunters poured in their armor, reflecting the golden light in harsh flashes. And Ethan's mind raced for a plan, because the throne was behind him, and the hunters were between them and the only exit. And he glanced at the girl, who shook her head as if reading his thoughts, telling him that if they tried to run now, they would be cut down before reaching the hall above. And another bolt struck the pillar, sending fragments of stone into the air, and Ethan shifted his position, crouching low to keep the girl shielded, and the hunters began to spread out, fanning through the chamber with slow, deliberate steps, and their leader, a tall figure with silver markings on its helmet, spoke in the alien tongue, the voice hard and sharp like metal striking stone, and the girl replied in the same language, her tone steady but laced with defiance, and Ethan could not understand the words, but he saw the way the leader's stance tightened, and the other hunters raised their weapons higher. And in that moment, one of the glowing symbols on the throne pulsed brighter, as if sensing the tension in the room, and the hum deepened until it felt like the floor was vibrating beneath them, and Ethan realized the machine was not entirely dormant. It was responding to the presence of the girl and perhaps to the threat she faced, and another bolt fired missing by a breath, and Ethan knew they could not hold this position for long, and he scanned the room for anything that could give them an advantage. His eyes landing on a cluster of crystal rods fixed into the walls that glowed faintly with the same golden hue as the throne, and he remembered how alien tech sometimes reacted to sudden impacts, and he reached for a piece of broken stone, hurling it at the nearest rod, and the instant it struck, a surge of light shot through the walls, blinding the hunters for a brief moment, and Ethan used the distraction to pull the girl toward the throne, her hands gripping his arm tightly as they moved, and the leader shouted something, and the sound of boots scraped against the floor as the hunters regrouped, firing wildly, but the throne's glow spread outward, forming a faint, shimmering barrier that absorbed the energy bolts before they could reach the seat, and Ethan realized this might be their only chance, and he sat the girl down onto the base of the throne, and her hands hesitated over the armrests, her eyes meeting his in a silent question, and he nodded without words, and she lowered herself into the seat. And the instant her body touched it, the spiral came alive, the golden light flooding the chamber until every shadow vanished, and the hum rose into a deep, resonant tone that seemed to pass straight through the bones, and the hunters froze mid-step, their weapons trembling as if the very air had turned against them, and the leader tried to give an order, but the words faltered as the throne's light wrapped around the girl like a living aura, and Ethan felt a change in the room, the shift of power from the hunters to her, and she spoke a single command in her language, and the hunters stumbled as if pushed by invisible hands, their weapons dropping to the floor with loud metallic clangs, and some turned and fled back into the tunnel, while others fell to their knees, their visors flickering with distorted images, and the leader remained standing, though its stance weakened, and Ethan stepped forward, ready to strike if needed, but the girl lifted her hand, stopping him, and spoke again, her voice calm but heavy with authority, and the leader slowly lowered its head before retreating without another word, and the throne's glow began to fade, the hum softening into silence, and the girl slumped slightly, her strength drained, but her eyes still clear, and she told Ethan that this victory would not last because her family's true army was far greater than these few, and that they would soon send forces the throne could not repel. And Motley helped her to her feet, knowing they had only moments to decide their next move, and he glanced toward the dark tunnel at the far side of the chamber, a possible escape route, though it might lead deeper into danger, and from the hall above came the faint but growing sound of engines, which meant more ships were landing, and the girl's voice was firm when she said they must leave now before the throne became the very trap her enemies had intended it to be, and Ethan nodded, lifting her once more and heading for the tunnel, their shadows stretching long behind them as the last of the golden light faded into the cold stone. The tunnel stretched on in twisting curves and uneven slopes, and Ethan kept moving with the girl in his arms, feeling the cold air grow sharper with every step, and the glow from the throne chamber was long gone, leaving only faint blue marks along the walls to guide them through the darkness, and his muscles ached from carrying her, but he did not slow because the echo of distant engines above told him the hunters would not be far behind, and the girl's voice was soft as she whispered that the path ahead would open into the ash fields, and that they would need to cross quickly before the storms came, and he asked what storm she meant, but she only shook her head, her eyes lowering as if remembering something she wished she could forget, and the tunnel began to rise, the air changing to carry the dry taste of dust and metal, and soon a dim light appeared ahead, not golden like the throne, but pale and cold, spilling through a jagged crack in the stone wall, and Ethan stepped through it into the open and saw the ash fields spread out like an endless sea of gray and black the ground, broken into ridges and deep pits, and here and there the skeletal remains of alien machines jutted from the surface, half buried in the dust, and the wind moved slowly over it, lifting small clouds of ash that drifted like ghostly smoke, and in the far distance he could see the faint outline of his ship resting near the shadow of a rock formation, but between them lay miles of open ground with no cover, and the girl's voice trembled as she said that the ash fields were treacherous because some places were hollow and would swallow anything that stepped on them, and Ethan took a deep breath, adjusting his grip on her, and stepped forward, feeling the surface give slightly under his boots, but holding, and he kept his eyes fixed ahead, searching for the safest route, and behind them, the sound of engines grew louder, joined by the faint metallic whine of drones scanning the air, and the girl's fingers dug into his jacket as she pointed to a narrow ridge that cut across part of the field, saying it would hold their weight better than the flat ground, and he changed his path toward it, moving faster now, though. Every step sent small clouds of ash rising around them, and the wind began to shift, bringing with it a low rumble that seemed to roll through the ground, and she whispered that the storm was coming sooner than she feared, and Ethan looked up to see the sky darkening, the clouds above swirling with streaks of red and gray, and flashes of lightning that were silent but fierce, and the ridge ahead was rough but solid, and he moved along it carefully, keeping his balance while the wind pushed harder, and the air began to carry stinging particles that bit into his skin, and from the corner of his eye he caught a flicker of movement and turned just in time to see a hunter drone sweeping low across the field, its red eye scanning and locking onto them, and it fired a bolt that struck the ridge ahead, sending shards of stone into the air, and Kaysen leaped over the gap, carrying her in both arms and landing hard but steady, and the drone swung around for another pass, and the girl raised her hand, her fingers trembling, and a pulse of blue light shot from her palm, striking the drone and sending it spiraling down into the ash, where it vanished with a hiss, and she slumped against him, her strength fading again, and he whispered for her to hold on because they were close now, though in truth the ship was still far across the shifting ground, and the storm was almost upon them, the wind now a constant howl, carrying sheets of ash that cut visibility to only a few steps ahead. And Ethan's boots slipped more than once on the unstable surface, but he pushed forward, every muscle burning with the effort. And the girl tried to speak, but her words were lost in the wind, and he felt her shiver as the cold deepened, and then, without warning, the ground beneath him gave way, dropping them into a shallow pit that filled instantly with a swirling cloud of ash, and his lungs burned as he fought to climb out, using one hand to grip the edge and the other to hold her above the rising dust, and he pulled them both up onto firmer ground, coughing and blinking against the stinging grit, and ahead the faint outline of the rock formation came into view through the haze, and he forced himself into a final push to storm raging at full strength now, lightning cracking silently above, while the air roared with the rush of the wind, and the first sight of the ship's dark shape gave him a surge of energy, and he reached it, slamming his hand against the panel to open the ramp and stumbling inside just as a blast of wind almost tore him backward, and the ramp closed, sealing them away from the storm, and he sat the girl down gently on the bench near the controls, and her eyes fluttered open long enough to meet his gaze before she whispered that they had escaped the hunters, but not the war, and then her head rested back and her breathing steadied as the ship's engines came alive, ready to lift them into the storm-filled sky and take them far from the graveyard, though Ethan knew there was no place far enough to escape what was coming next. The engines of the ship roared against the howl of the storm, and Ethan gripped the controls tightly, feeling the vibrations run through the seat as he lifted off from the ash fields, the gray haze swallowing the view outside, and the girl sat beside him, her eyes half closed but watching the flickering lights on the console, as if memorizing every movement he made, and the storm outside shook the hull with bursts of invisible force while the sensors warned of multiple signatures closing in fast and nigh. Ethan switched the display to track mode, seeing red markers appearing all around them, climbing through the clouds and breaking into open air, and the girl's voice was quiet but steady as she told him that the hunters had called reinforcements and that this time they would come with warships, not just drones, and Ethan's jaw tightened as he adjusted the course, trying to weave between the heavier currents of the storm to hide their heat signature, and for a moment, the markers faded slightly as the storm's interference scattered the scans, but then the sensors screamed again as 3 fast attack crafts locked on from above and began their dive, and the girl leaned forward, pointing toward a narrow gap in the storm wall where lightning flashed in jagged spirals, and she said they could break through into the upper atmosphere if they reached it before the hunters closed the gap, and Ethan pushed the engines harder, feeling the ship strain under the pressure and the metal panels creak, but the distance to the gap shrank fast until the first blast from the attackers shook them sideways and alarms filled the cabin. And Ethan steadied the ship, rolling to throw off their aim while triggering the auto turrets mounted under the wings, and streams of bright energy cut across the gray air, striking one of the pursuing crafts and sending it spinning into the storm below, and the girl's eyes followed the remaining 2 as they split to attack from both sides, their fire hammering against the shields which flickered under the strain, and Ethan twisted the controls, dropping the ship suddenly to pass under one attacker before pulling up sharply and letting the turrets tear into its belly until it erupted in a burst of orange light, and the last craft stayed behind them, matching every move and firing steadily. And Ethan's hands moved over the controls in rapid motions, switching power from non-essential systems to the rear shields and pushing the engines into a short burst that threw them forward just enough to clear the mouth of the gap into the thinner air above, and the sudden calm after the storm was sharp and cold, the stars clear against the black and the planets curve visible below, but the sensors still showed danger ahead as a massive red signature emerged from the darkness, a warship far larger than anything Ethan's vessel could outrun, and the girl's expression darkened as she whispered that this was the ship of her family's high commander, and that if they caught them here, there would be no escape. And Ethan's mind raced for options, scanning the system for any asteroid belts or debris fields to hide in, but the nearest cover was too far, and the warship was closing fast, its weapons charging, and the girl turned to him, saying that there was one way to stop them, if only for a short time, and that she needed to access the ship's comm system to send a code she had learned long ago before they had turned against her. And Ethan hesitated for only a second before rerouting control to her station, and she began entering a sequence, her fingers moving with precision. Despite the weakness in her body, and outside, the warship slowed, as if listening to the signal, its massive guns shifting slightly off target. But the moment passed quickly, and the warship's engines flared again, as if breaking free of the command, and the girl's shoulders slumped, her voice quiet, as she said the code would not hold them long, and Ethan knew that meant they needed another plan immediately, and his eyes scanned the weapons panels, settling on the last pair of heavy missiles that had been kept in reserve for emergencies, and this was as close to the end as it could get. So he armed them both and set a course straight toward the warship, ignoring the rising proximity alarms, and the girl looked at him in surprise, asking if he planned to ram it, but he shook his head and explained that he would drop the missiles at the last moment, then spin away while they tracked the warship's heat, and the plan would work only if their timing was perfect. And the warship loomed ahead, its hull a wall of dark metal lined with glowing red ports, and Ethan pushed the throttle to maximum, feeling the ship tremble under the acceleration, and the distance closed fast until the warning lights bathed the cabin in red, and he released both missiles before slamming the controls into a hard turn, the engines straining as the ship swung wide, and the missiles streaked ahead, locking onto the warship's massive frame and exploding in a double burst that lit the void in gold and white, and the shockwave sent Ethan's vessel tumbling until he fought it back into balance and through the viewport. He saw the warship drifting, its lights flickering but not destroyed, and the girl met his eyes, saying that they had bought time but not safety, and that the war was now chasing them through the stars. And Ethan set the course for deep space, his hands steady on the controls and his mind already preparing for the next fight. The ship moved through the black expanse of space, leaving the wounded warship behind. But Ethan knew it would not remain crippled for long, and the stars outside seemed calm, yet carried the weight of pursuit, and the girl sat quietly beside him, her eyes fixed on the void ahead, and after a long silence, she began to speak, her voice soft but steady, telling him that when she was born, she had been promised a seat on the council of her family's empire, but as she grew, she had seen the cruelty they used to rule, and she had refused to swear loyalty to their wars, and because of that, they had called her a danger and stripped her of her rights before casting her into exile in the graveyard. And Ethan listened without interrupting, his hands resting on the controls as her words painted the picture of betrayal and survival, and she told him that the throne they had found was built by the first memory, a device meant not for power over weapons, but for power over thought, allowing its user to speak into the minds of every being in the empire and shape their beliefs. And she had refused to use it because she knew it could be twisted into a tool for control, and Ethan understood now why they feared her, because in her hands, the throne could have ended the endless wars and broken their hold over billions, and yet she had chosen not to abuse it. And he asked what she would do now that she was free, and her gaze turned from the stars to him as she said freedom was a lie. If it meant leaving others in chains, and that she could no longer hide from the fight, even if it meant returning to the heart of the empire. And the moment hung heavy between them as the sensors beeped softly, warning of new signatures at the edge of their range, smaller than the warship, but moving fast. And the girl's eyes narrowed as she said they were scouts meant to track and signal their position to the main fleet. And Ethan adjusted the course to weave through a nearby asteroid field, where the jagged rocks spun slowly in the darkness, casting shadows across the hull, and the ship slid between them while the scouts followed, sending pings into the void. And one came close enough for its light to flash across the cockpit, and Ethan swung the vessel sharply to the side, letting a large fragment of rock pass between them before firing a short burst from the rear cannons that struck the scout's engine and sent it spinning away into the shadows. And the second scout pulled back but kept transmitting, and the girl's voice was tense as she said they could not allow it to signal the fleet, or their small victory against the warship would mean nothing. And Ethan pushed the ship into a tight loop, circling around a cluster of asteroids until they came up behind the scout, and fired again, the blast tearing through its frame and leaving silence in its wake. And for a brief moment, the sensors were clear, and the girl let out a breath she had been holding, and she said this was the first time since the graveyard that she felt a spark of hope. And Ethan allowed himself a faint smile, though it faded quickly as he thought about the road ahead. And she turned to him, saying she wanted to make a choice, one that would decide both their futures. And she asked if he would stand with her if she returned to claim the throne, not to rule but to dismantle the power it held so no one could use it again. And Ethan met her gaze and said he would stand with her until the end, whatever came. And her eyes softened, but her posture straightened, as if the weight of her decision had already begun to settle on her shoulders. And they set a course not away from the empire, but toward it, knowing the journey would take them through hostile systems and battles they might not survive, and hours passed in the hum of the engines and the slow drift of the stars, until the faint glow of a distant sun rose ahead, casting their path in silver light. And the girl sat forward, her voice clear as she said that if they succeeded, she would no longer be a princess or a fugitive, but simply a voice among free people. And if they failed, they would be remembered as nothing more than rebels lost in the dark. And Ethan reached over resting a hand on hers, a silent promise that he was ready to face whatever waited at the end of their flight. And as the ship cut through the void, the stars seemed to burn brighter, as if marking their passage toward the heart of an empire that had once abandoned her in the cold silence of a graveyard, and now would see her return not as prey, but as a storm.